Chapter 13. Two Unusual Strangers. Virginia held onto Charles tightly as they soared through the forest. They came close to hitting trees, but with the pivot of his body and the turn and thrust of his wings, Charles dodged every single one like a sparrow flying through a bush. The light from within him illuminated all that was near, like a lantern in the night. Virginia heard the wolves catching up to them. They ran along the ground and jumped from tree to tree, sinking their claws deep into their branches and trunks. The multitude of green eyes was closing in on them. "Charles!" she shouted. "They're getting closer!" Charles looked up. Virginia followed his gaze and saw thousands of green eyes jumping across the air from the branches above them. Like growling monsters and howling ghosts, they dove from the treetops like torpedoes towards Charles and Virginia. Virginia screamed and placed her face into Charles's chest. Instantly, Charles turned his body as a wolf fell right past them, so close that Virginia felt its greasy black hair brush against the back of her neck. More wolves fell from the canopy towards them, but quickly pivoting his body from left to right and spinning through the air, Charles dodged every single one that fell their way. Instantly, Charles's wings began to shine brighter and clap harder and harder. Virginia watched as their speed more than doubled, and soon the hungry eyes of the phantoms behind them began to dwindle out of sight. A loud wolf cry echoed through the forest. Darkrai stood back at the campfire. He heard the call of those ahead of him in the charge. He raised his head and let out a loud cry in return. From the shadow's edge of the campfire came Princess Aniatha. Her long black hair and red dress swayed faintly in the light breeze of the early morning. She approached Darkrai, standing by the fire. "Darkrai," she said, "what has happened? Have they seized them or not?" The demon turned to face Aniatha. Extending one of its front paws, he lowered his head to her. "Your Highness, the spirit of Oralmuti is strong in the warrior. He has gained unusual agility. He and the girl are escaping." Aniatha looked intently into the distance from where they had fled. Time to bring out another demon of the forest. She lifted her hand as if to raise something from the ground and channeled a loud, peculiar whistle that initially sounded like a faint dog whistle, but slowly swelled into a high-pitched screech. All went quiet for a moment, then a loud, whimpering groan echoed in the distance throughout the forest. Darkrai and Aniatha heard all the wolves in the woods shriek and whimper. After a few seconds, many ran back towards the campsite and stopped in front of Aniatha and Darkrai, breathing hard. "One of them has awakened," panted one of the wolves. "It ate two from our pack." "Charles!" shouted Virginia. "Charles! They've left us!" Charles continued to soar hard through the woods. "What? They have stopped following us!" A loud wail cried through the forest, shaking the trees like an earthquake. Charles instantly landed on the ground and hid Virginia and himself behind a small pine tree. He placed her back against it, cupped his hand over her mouth, and leaned in close. Then slowly, very slowly, he let go of her mouth and placed his index finger to his lips. "Shh," he whispered. The light inside him and his wings began to dim to where it was nothing more than a simple candlelight from within his stomach. All became very dark. Charles grabbed the handle of his sword in both of his hands and peered around the tree. "Charles," whispered Virginia, "what is going on?" Suddenly, the ground began to shake like a loud pulse, followed shortly by another pulse, and then another. Charles leaned back to face Virginia. She could barely see the outline of his face, but could clearly hear the caution in his voice. "Virginia," he said, "you are going to have to run ahead without me." "Darkrai," said Aniatha, "take some of the strong and brave wolves with you and scout for her." She stroked her hand upon the shoulder of the beast. "But be careful, my love. I would not want you to become an early breakfast for that grumpy monster out there." As he looked into the distance, Darkrai smiled at the thought of his prey and howled into the night. He barked at the pack standing before him and charged into the forest, followed by 5 loyal wolves who obeyed his command. Virginia's eyes shot open. "What?" Charles quickly placed his hand over her mouth. Shh. There was another loud quaking pulse that shook the ground. "It's getting closer," he said. "You need to run ahead of me, and I'll fight it off. I might even be able to kill it. If not, then I'll come and catch up with you." He took his hand away from her mouth and pointed behind him. "Go that way. You are not far from the Great Canyon. The sun will soon rise behind you as you run. When you reach the canyon, follow the trail to the south that runs along the edge of the canyon and don't stop running. I'll catch up with you." "What? What are you talking about? The wolves stopped following us." "Yes, they've stopped following us." Charles peered his head around the tree again, "because something far worse was awakened." Virginia's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" There was another loud pulse that shook the ground. Charles leaned in and faced Virginia. "I can see it. It's just on the other side of the tree, but it's facing the wrong way. Now is your chance. Go!" "Charles, what is it? Whatever it is, can't we both just fly away from it together?" "No, it has locked onto your scent. It has been awakened and won't go back to sleep unless it is knocked unconscious or killed." Another pulse came right behind the tree. Virginia looked up and saw a large gray hand with black split fingernails wrapping its fingers around the middle of the tree above them. She felt her knees give. Charles picked her back up. "Listen to me," he said. "This is it. You can do it. I'm not going to leave you. I'll be right behind you." Charles placed Virginia behind him. "Run west at my signal." From behind the tree came a sizable, dark face. It leaned in towards Charles and Virginia, sniffing deep breaths through its nostrils. A deep growl groaned through its mouth. Virginia saw its other hand reaching to grab them. At that moment, Charles roared a thundering battle cry and brought his sword down upon the hand of the devilish creature, slicing its index finger off. The light instantly shined bright again from within him, and the glow of his wings returned to their former splendor. The face of the silhouette monster became visible. It had the ears of a bat, the fangs of a snake, the nostrils of a horse, and the face of a wild ape. It covered its black, bug-like eyes from the light within Charles and fell back to the ground. "Virginia, run!" shouted Charles. His voice was deep and sounded like a storm. Without hesitation, Virginia dashed in the direction Charles had instructed her to run. The woods became thick. Branches slapped her in the face like bony hands. Thorns wrapped around her ankles like vipers. She tripped over a log and fell face down in a pile of mud. A loud, whimpering cry from the beast behind her sent her scrambling to her feet. She charged and plowed through the thicket like a frightened doe. She ran into a web of vines that sent her flying back on the ground like a spring. She got back up and tried to wiggle her way through the net, but all desperate attempts were unsuccessful. There was a flash of brilliance and a resounding battle cry followed by the deafening clap of thunder behind her. She then heard the beast shrieking in pain. She looked down and remembered the knife about her waist. Quickly, she drew it, held it high in the air, and brought it down upon the vined webbing in front of her. All the strands split in half with one stroke of the blade. She drew a long breath. Directly in front of her was the path leading toward the edge of the woods. She sprinted down the trail to the opening of the forest. A large black creature leaped out of the trees in front of her, planted itself in the center of the trail, and gave a horrifying bark. Virginia stopped in her tracks. 5 more, just like it, lunged out from the sides of the path and stood behind their leader, growling. All 6 wolves began to walk toward her. Virginia slowly backed up. She felt her back hit an object behind her. She turned around and saw that it was a large oak tree with a red color around its base. "You gave us quite a scare," said the leader. "You do realize this?" Virginia looked at all the wolves slowly coming closer to her. Her hands began shaking and her heart raced in her chest. "Who are you?" she screamed. Tears began to run down her face. "What do you want from me?" "My name is Dark Cry." A ravaging look came over his eyes as saliva trailed out of his mouth even more. "And my princess wants you, Cohen. I am here to retrieve you to her. Dead or alive is up to you." The ground began to shake, and the dirt beneath the wolves started to soften and break apart. Immediately, like lightning from the earth, a root shot up from the ground and wrapped around the neck of one of the wolves behind Dark Cry. The wolf was allowed only a whimper before being dragged beneath the earth. All the wolves scattered. More roots sprung like serpents from the earth. The tree behind Virginia began to moan and move. She looked up and saw its branches swaying to and fro. Then, like a club, it brought one of its limbs down on top of another wolf, crushing it. A root wrapped around its corpse like a snake, dragging it down to its grave below. The wolves began to jump from left to right. They barked and growled at the tree and tried to attack its roots with their teeth and claws, but the mighty oak groaned even louder, as if it was laughing at their defiance. It brought 2 of its branches down between Virginia and the wolves. Then, like the parting of the Red Sea, it tossed the remaining dogs into the woods on either side of the path, clearing the way for Virginia. A branch came down and gave Virginia a slight little nudge from behind. She looked up at the mighty oak and heard it groaning. One of its branches pointed toward the exit of the woods. The oak groaned again, and this time Virginia thought she almost heard it moaning the word, "Run." She took off down the path. "Thank you," she shouted back at the tree. She heard wolves being swatted, smacked, and tossed around by the tree behind her, but she did not stop to look over her shoulder. She could see the light of morning barely breaking ahead of her. Hope kindled within her soul. "I'm free! I'm free!" She ran through the edge of the woods, out into the open, and did not stop. The light of the morning fell upon her face. She looked over her shoulder and saw the rising sun beginning to peek over the treetops behind her. She turned her head back around. "Ah!" she screamed. Her feet slid as she came to a sudden halt. In front of her toes was the edge of a cliff that fell into a dark, misty bottom. She looked in amazement in front of her. Stretching for a few miles to the west was an enormous canyon. It ran from north to south as far as the eye could see. Its floor was covered in a blanket of thick mist and darkness. Gigantic clefts of rock shot out from its bed below, towering like skyscrapers in random arrangement all over the canyon. "The Great Canyon. This is it." She looked down to her left and saw a path she thought was big enough to comfortably fit 2 of her uncle's pickup trucks, leading south along the edge of the canyon and running along the right side of the mountain. There was a loud bark coming from behind her. Virginia turned around and saw 4 pairs of green eyes charging at her from the dark path of the forest. Instantly, she ran south down the road alongside the cliff's edge. Her legs felt like jelly. Her heart still raced, but her body began to grow weak. She cried with every step she ran. She looked over her shoulder and saw 4 black beasts charging and barking behind her on the same path. They drew closer with every stride they took. Tears flooded down her cheeks. "Just leave me alone!" A tackle from behind sent her falling to her face. Her knife flew out of her hand, landing far down the path ahead of her. A massive, bulky creature held her down on the ground. With its teeth, it snatched her backpack off her shoulders and tossed it to her left at the skirt of the mountain. She began to cry louder. "No, no, let me go!" She felt a paw on each foot, pressing her ankles to the ground. The creature on top of her fastened her elbows to the earth with its front paws. She looked up and saw the phantom, who identified himself as Darkcry, and another massive wolf standing before her. Darkcry slowly approached her and lowered his snout inches from her nose. "You think that we are hideous, that we are pure, ugly, and evil," he hissed. "Well, you might be right." A dark cloud of sulfur and shadow began to permeate from within his belly. Eventually, the wolf vanished into the thickness of the cloud. There was the sound of bones shifting. The cloud dissolved, and out rose a man dressed in a black hooded trench coat, dark buckskin pants, a black breechcloth, and a pair of black moccasins. His hair was long, dark, and trailed in the breeze of the cliff. A long, curved sword was strapped to his side. His skin was a lifeless tan color. His exposed upper body was rugged and athletic, cut like a diamond. He towered over Virginia, looking down at her like she was a helpless rabbit. "But, you see," he continued, "we are not all that hideous looking after all. Now are we?" Darkcry squatted down to Virginia. "Tell me, Cohen, how does it feel to have your enemies trample you underfoot like a worm?" All the phantoms around Virginia began to bark and laugh at her. Virginia just tried to hold back her tears. "What do you want from me?" "What do I want from you?" asked Darkcry with a raised brow. "Absolutely nothing. But you see, it's not about what I want. This is about the wishes of those whom I serve. My betrothed princess in those woods is the one you should be asking. Her family has lived in peace for so long, for generations. Then, one day, the sign of the prophecy appeared and disrupted everything. Cohen, I can only imagine after I'm finished with you, you would have wished you had never set foot back into Aletheia." He grabbed Virginia by the throat and pulled her off the ground. The tips of her toes danced around on the rocky, dusty path as he carried her over to the edge of the cliff and held her out over the canyon. "Now, I'm going to ask you a few simple questions," said Darkrai, "and you will answer them, or I will experiment to see if the legend is true." She held on tight to Darkrai's wrists and began to choke on her own words through his firm grip on her throat. "What legend?" Darkrai smiled a malicious grin. "That if you can truly fly or not. After all, it was through your people that Oralmuti blessed Burning Eagle with his wings, light, and fire. Am I right?" More tears began to run down her face. What is he talking about? Why am I here? Why is this happening to me? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know your queen. I'm not Cohen. Darkrai's grip tightened around Virginia's neck. "Don't lie to me. Now our queen says that you have a secret book in your possession. Where is it? Give it to me." Does he mean the diary? What book? What are you talking about? You know what book I speak of. It is in your possession. It is the key to our victory and the ticket to your freedom. Now, for the last time. Where is it? Instantly, the words of Rose Cohen ran through her mind like a desperate plea from the past. "I strongly caution you. This diary contains material that could greatly expose my children and their children's children after them to extreme danger should it be discovered by the wrong hands." Virginia had a choice to make. She saw her backpack leaning against the side of the mountain behind Darkrai. She looked back into his face. If I give him that diary, I risk endangering the descendants of Rose Cohen. Virginia worked up a wad of saliva in her mouth and spat in Darkrai's face. Her once sad and desperate face now carried the look of an angry, bold martyr. "I will never tell you where it is, even if you keep me alive," she exclaimed as best she could. Darkrai's face became blood red with anger. He wiped the spit from his face. "Then I have my answer to my first question. Now for my second question." Virginia felt his fingers begin to loosen around her neck. "Can you really fly?" Virginia felt her life flash before her eyes as Darkrai's grip slowly began to release her neck. Will anybody remember me? An even more critical thought ran through her mind. Am I ready to die? Is there really an eternity beyond this point? Am I ready for it? "We're coming!" echoed a voice south of the path. "We're coming! Hold on! We're coming!" Virginia, Darkrai, and the other 3 wolves behind them all looked down the trail and saw an odd, unusual sight. Far in the distance, rounding the bend of the mountainside, was a teenage boy pulling behind him a brown wooden rickshaw. He drew closer and came to a sudden stop about 50 feet in front of them. Virginia got a good look at the boy. He appeared to be no more than about 16 or 17 years old. He had a blindfold wrapped around his eyes and shaggy blonde hair parted down the middle, flowing down the sides of his face. A braid trailed from behind his left ear down to his shoulder, with a white feather attached at the end. A green cloak was tied around his neck. He wore skin-tight brown leather pants, black leather boots, and a white Highlander shirt that went down into a V-neck with its drawstrings loosely fastened in front of his chest, and a red sash that wrapped around the edge of his shirt at his waist. A bow and quiver were strapped over his right shoulder, and a sword, similar to Charles's, was fastened around his left shoulder. The young youth placed both of his fists on his hips. "I dare say!" Suddenly, the cart tipped backward behind him. "Ow!" came a cry from within the rickshaw. Out from its containments tumbled another teenager about the same age as the one who had let go of the cart. The blindfolded guy walked over to him. "Oh, hi, I'm sorry, bro. I meant to catch you." "Oh, stop it," moaned the one on the ground. Get back, I can handle myself." The blindfolded one watched as he saw his friend stumbling to get up. "You slept too long, my friend. I warned you that we weren't too far away from them." Virginia watched as the teenager rose from the ground and stood straight and tall. His body was massive, as if he could have been on the high school football or wrestling team. He stood over 6 feet tall and must have weighed well over 200 pounds of pure muscle. His skin was dark, his eyes brown, his head shaved, and his features appeared Middle Eastern. He wore a light, white cotton scarf about his neck, a pair of red baggy Bedouin pants, and sandals. He wore a sword strapped around his right shoulder, also similar to Charles's sword, and carried in his hand a massive hammer with an iron head and a handle that stretched over 5 feet. "So," he said, disappointed, "is this all of them? I was seriously hoping there would be more wolves." The blindfolded youth turned his head towards Virginia. A white dove flew out of the sky and landed on the end of the feathers in his quiver. Even though his sight was covered, Virginia felt like his eyes were locked onto hers. He walked over to her, and Darkcry. "My, you're quite the gentleman," he said to Darkcry as he drew near. "Who are you?" shouted Darkcry. "And what do you want with our business?" The teenage boy gave Darkcry a firm pat on his shoulder. "Easy, old chap. It's not all about you now. Can't you see that? Right now I have special business with this young lady." He slowly turned his focus back towards Virginia. A big grin stretched from ear to ear on his face, as if he had found a long-lost treasure. "Are you the Virginia Singerman?" Virginia's attention was split from hanging on tightly to Darkcry's wrist for dear life and managing a new and slightly awkward conversation with the guy beside her. What? She coughed. "Are you the Virginia Singerman?" he repeated. Yes, I am." "Thank you," he exclaimed with a joyful expression. "That's all we need to know." He turned around to face his friend back of the rickshaw. "Good news, Nathaniel. We found her." "Enough of this!" exclaimed Darkcry. "Either you leave us alone to our business or we will kill you." "Virginia," said the boy, turning his focus back to her, "I'm going to ask you to grab onto my arm." He extended his hand out to her. Darkcry gripped his left hand into a fist and swung it at the boy's face. Without a flinch or a twitch, the blindfolded youth caught the blow in his hand just before impact. He turned to face Darkcry in the eyes. "Bet you didn't see that coming," teased the boy, smiling. Darkcry became alert. "Wait, I know you from somewhere." The boy's face stretched into a comical smile. "Oh, you teasing devil, and I thought you had forgotten us." Darkcry's eyes became slightly worried. You're... Come on, you're almost there. It's on the tip of your tongue. I can see it." "You're his companions." "Excellent! We're almost there. Now we both need to make sure of this. Who is the his you're speaking of?" The boy leaned in and whispered, "Let's face it, we both know it's Soaring Eagle, so let's just skip that part. Now for the big one. What are our names?" Darkcry stared at him, completely and utterly perplexed. Anger and confusion raced through his veins, numbing his ability to engage in this taunting, unusual conversation. "Enough of this!" yelled Darkcry. The teenage boy shook his head. Forget it. I'll just tell you myself." Seeing that her foe's attention was no longer on her, Virginia let go of Darkcry's wrist and latched onto the arm of the blindfolded guy. Feeling her grip, the boy pulled her instantly away from the cliff and out of Darkcry's grip. Then, with a strong swing, he threw her back towards the rickshaw, where the other guy caught her. The teenager released Darkcry's fist and leaped backward toward the two behind him. "My name is Tristan, and this is my friend Nathaniel." He pointed towards Virginia, who was leaning back up against Nathaniel, "and we're here for her." Tristan placed one fist on his hip and pointed his finger at Darkcry. "Don't worry, you'll get our names soon enough. If you don't soon, it's just gonna get embarrassing for you, man. Just saying. We've thwarted you and your operations off and on with Soaring Eagle for how many years now?" Darkcry released a loud, frustrated yell and pointed his finger toward Tristan, Nathaniel, and Virginia. "Get them!" The 3 wolves standing by began to growl and walk towards the other 3, their hair raised high on their backs. Nathaniel placed Virginia behind him and held his hammer firmly in both hands. Tristan reached behind his back, hiding his hands inside his cloak, and smiled. "Oh, this is gonna be fun." The 3 wolves stood in a triangle formation with a bulky, dirty phantom at the front apex of the arrangement. He growled and barked at Tristan. Saliva dripped from his teeth, and black-yellow sulfur fumed from his mouth. "Ugh, you're nasty," said Tristan. The wolf sneered at Tristan. With a loud bark, he lunged at him, its razor-sharp nails and teeth fixed out in front. From behind his back, Tristan withdrew his right hand, holding a deer antler with 6 long spikes. Then, with an uppercut stroke, he thrust the antler's prongs underneath the wolf's jaw. The creature whelped. It opened its mouth, and Virginia could see the antler running through its jaw like a hook. Its legs kicked and squirmed, trying to pull itself away from the blindfolded warrior, but Tristan held strong, not letting the beast free. With a strong arm, he raised the head of the wolf high above his own. Then, with a single stroke, he threw the beast over the path's edge, sending him to the dark, misty bed of the great canyon below. The other two wolves jumped back a step. They looked at the deer antler covered in black blood in Tristan's hand. "What are you waiting for?" yelled Darkrai at the remaining two phantoms. "Get them!" Tristan withdrew his left hand behind his waist, wielding another deer antler with 6 spikes. "Think twice," he warned the two wolves while smiling big. "I'm ready whenever you are." Hesitating, both phantoms stood looking at the bloody antler. "Did you not hear my orders?" thundered Darkrai. "Kill him now!" Both phantoms shook their head as if waking from a dream. They leered at Tristan and growled viciously at him. They both charged. The dove took to the air off Tristan's quiver and flew between him and the wolves, running in his direction. It let out a high-pitched squawk, a sound Virginia thought only a hawk or an eagle could make. The first wolf made it to Tristan and reached out to bite his knees. Tristan stretched both hands out side to side and brought the deer antlers together like a mighty clamp, spiking deeply on either side of the beast's neck. He stepped back and spun around counterclockwise, spinning the wolf in his grip like a vortex. Then, using the wolf in his clasp, he swatted the other phantom that also charged toward him like a bat, sending it tumbling off the cliff's edge. Tristan spun around one more time before releasing the wolf he had in his grip and sending it flying over the edge. Tristan turned around, held the antlers by his side, and faced Darkrai. "What else do you have?" Darkrai's face flushed red with anger. He clenched his fist, raised his head up to the sky, and hollered demonically. Virginia watched as black and red sulfur came vaporing out of his mouth. A dark cloud began to permeate the air around him, completely engulfing him in its haze. She heard the sound of bones shifting from within the black smoke. His unholy cry turned into the sound of a loud wolf howl. A pair of green eyes appeared in the dark, misty shadows. The cloud dissolved, and all that remained was a massive wolf. Virginia heard barks and growls above her. She looked up and saw numerous large wolves like Darkrai leaning over the sides of the paths that ran around the mountain above them, all drooling, barking, and licking their teeth as they looked down at Tristan, Nathaniel, and her. Tristan and Nathaniel looked up at the hungry beasts. "Ah, yes," said Nathaniel, relieved. "Finally! And I thought I was going to be bored this whole time." Nathaniel looked at Virginia and pointed to the rickshaw. "It might not look like much, but you'll be safer inside of our cart." Virginia looked at the wooden rickshaw. Its long wooden handles reared upwards as it leaned back upon its only 2 wheels. Its sunshade canopy was fabricated with red cloth and furnished inside with red cushions, an unusually huge resting section for a rickshaw. Unsure of anything now, Virginia complied, climbed inside the cart, and crawled deep into the cave of its awning. "Is he going to be okay all by himself?" she asked, pointing at Tristan. Nathaniel laughed. "Oh, trust me, he will be just fine." Or, as he likes to say, "There's more to him than meets the eye." Tristan stuck both antlers into the ground, pulled his bow behind his back, and attached an arrow to its string. Nathaniel held his hammer firmly in his right hand and looked at Virginia. "Trust me, this isn't our first rodeo." The wolves growled and barked louder than before. Some began to climb down the side of the mountain. Nathaniel spread both arms wide, stuck his chest out towards his foes, and laughed like a taunting kid. "What have you got for me, mutts? What have you got?" A large wolf jumped into the air and lunged for Nathaniel. Nathaniel swung his large hammer in an arch stroke above his head, nailing the beast in the chest. The phantom fell to the ground, whimpering. Nathaniel brought the hammer down upon the creature for a final blow. 3 wolves jumped down toward Tristan. The dove flew between him and the reigning phantoms. As fast as lightning, Tristan shot 3 arrows into the sky, each one finishing off his enemies. Virginia observed the scene in speculation. Forest phantoms ran down from the side of the mountain like an avalanche toward Tristan and Nathaniel. The dove kept flying around Tristan like a tornado, squawking at random. Tristan turned in each direction from where the bird cried and launched an arrow at each phantom that ran or jumped in his direction. Nothing was able to come closer than 5 feet from touching him. Nathaniel was the biggest kid she had ever seen. He swung his hammer at the beast like a boy smacking multiple pinatas. Wild wolves jumped and ran at him from all directions, but he just laughed and swung the colossal hammer, swatting each one, sending them flying back from where they came or over the cliff's edge. Virginia heard a growl above her. She looked up. A large black wolf jumped off the side of the mountain towards the rickshaw. Virginia fell back as far as she could into the awning of the cart. The monster fell on top of the rickshaw and looked at Virginia with hungry eyes. "You look delicious, Your Highness," said the wolf, reaching in to grab Virginia with its drooling teeth. "And you look ugly," came Nathaniel's voice from behind. The wolf's eyes widened. Instantly, Nathaniel grabbed the wolf by its hind paw and pulled it out of the rickshaw. He swung the massive beast back and forth like a club, hitting it against oncoming wolves. Nathaniel continued to laugh like a big child as he dual-wielded the wolf in one hand and his hammer in the other, smashing, swatting, and thrashing both of his instruments against his oncoming foes. Tristan held an arrow chambered in his bow. 10 demons surrounded him. He smiled and turned his head as if to look at them out of the corner of his eye through his blindfold. The dove came and landed on his quiver behind him. It spread its wings out and gave a loud squawk. The wolves began to enclose around Tristan. They growled at him through their saliva-drenched teeth. Their nostrils vapored yellow, red, and black sulfur. The bridges of their snouts wrinkled as they barked viciously at him. The dove upon Tristan's quiver flapped its wings together. At the same time, Tristan fell to the earth on one knee and slammed his palm to the ground. A powerful gust of wind blasted through his hand and blew upon the ground around him, sending any foe encompassing him flying back like leaves in every direction. Darkcry looked at the battle in disappointment. Suddenly, his ears perked up. He looked behind him. Quickly, he ran towards the mountainside and began to climb up away from the battle. "Well now, where do you think he's running off to?" Tristan shouted to Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked up and saw Darkcry running up the mountain while the last few wolves were charging down. He bellowed out with a loud laugh. "What? Is he scared or something? I doubt that we scared him." A mighty clap of thunder, followed by the shrilling cry of a monster, came from the forest north of the path. Ripping out of the trees tumbled a giant, dark beast that stood at least 3 stories high. It had deep gash wounds on its body that oozed out black blood. Its tail had been sliced off and 2 of its fingers were missing. It crashed to the ground with a mighty thud, sending a quaking pulse on the earth. All the phantoms stopped their attack and turned to look up the path. Seeing the monster slowly rising to its feet, they all darted back up the mountainside, whimpering and crying in fear. "Ah," said Tristan, "I was right. Let the record show that I was so right. It was definitely not us that scared Darkcry." The tall monster stood up and looked down the path past Tristan and Nathaniel, fixing its large, black, deadly eyes upon Virginia. It let out a deep growl at her. Tristan and Nathaniel turned to look at Virginia. "Have you seen this monster before?" asked Nathaniel. Virginia looked back at both of them. "Why are you focusing on me? There's a giant monster behind you both. Aren't you worried about it?" "Yes, it was hunting Charles and me back in the woods." Tristan laughed and pointed his thumb over his shoulder at the injured creature. "Well, that would explain the thunder sounds and multiple gash wounds on it." The monster let out a mighty roar through its bleeding mouth. Tristan and Nathaniel turned around and faced the monster. "Big," said Tristan. "Ugly," said Nathaniel. "Already maimed by Soaring Eagle. It must be a strong one to have endured these many strikes. I mean, look at that blood." "It's a hard call, man," said Tristan. "How do you want to bring this one down?" Nathaniel held his hammer up closer. "Well, I could always split its kneecaps, leaving you for the killing stroke." "Nah, it would swat you away before you could get close. We would need someone faster, someone who could attack it from behind, someone like..." The cry of an eagle echoed from within the woods behind the monster. The tall beast looked over its shoulder into the woods. Tristan raised his eyebrows. "Oh, this is going to get very interesting." "What was that?" asked Virginia. "What was that sound?" The monster turned and let out a loud, groaning roar at the 3 down the path. Then, with all the strength left inside him, it charged at them. "Your Highness," said Nathaniel, "no matter what happens, stay behind us." "Should we wait for him to come out of the woods first, like last time?" Tristan asked Nathaniel. "It's coming!" shouted Virginia. "Shouldn't we run?" "I'm gonna wait for him," replied Nathaniel to Tristan. "Come on!" screamed Virginia. "Let's go!" "Just like the last time?" asked Tristan. "That's what I'm expecting him to do," replied Nathaniel. Suddenly, a bright orb of light ripped out of the treetops and shot like a bullet into the sky, with a trail of light following in its path. "Get ready," said Tristan. Virginia looked high above the monster at the small, glowing orb in the sky. What is that? A battle cry sounded from the heavens. The beast stopped running and turned to look behind itself. It fixed its eyes upon the star shining brightly in the sky. "Now!" shouted Nathaniel. He charged up to the beast, tightening the grip on his hammer. He raised it high, and with a mighty stroke brought it down upon the creature's right knee. The beast let out a cry of pain and fell on one leg. It raised its hand high, ready to swat Nathaniel off the cliff. The dove flew up across the monster's hand and let out a mighty squawk. Tristan launched 3 arrows into the beast's palm just before it could bring it down upon Nathaniel. The monster grabbed its wounded hand and cried out even louder in pain. Another cry came from the sky. Virginia looked up and saw the glowing star in the heavens charge down at the monster like a lightning bolt. With a mighty clap of thunder and an explosion of light, it crashed into the center of the creature's back. The monster let out a final cry before falling prostrate to the ground. The earth shook as it smashed into the dirt. Dust splashed high all around them. The creature stopped panting, and then all was quiet. Virginia squinted her eyes through the cloud of dust at the scene. She fixed her eyes upon the star from the heavens stationed upon the back of the beast. His eyes blazed with a bright blue and white color. He stood tall and strong, pulling out the large double-edged sword he had plunged deep into the monster's back. His white wings spread out wide, shining splendorous colors. The glow from within his core radiated brightly. Slowly, she climbed out of the rickshaw and walked closer to the light. The nearer she drew, the clearer her vision became. "Charles?" she asked. Charles fixed his bright, shining eyes upon Virginia and smiled at her. Nathaniel climbed on top of the giant, dead monster and stood on its right shoulder, leaning upon his hammer like a staff. Tristan walked over and stood on the left side of the slain beast. The dove that had been flying around him flew over and landed on his quiver once again. All 3 companions looked at Virginia with pleasant faces. She looked back at them with multiple questions flowing through her mind. Who are you?
This is the end of Chapter 13. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 14. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.